Joining us now, we have Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, the one and only Glenn Greenwald. Of course, you guys know he's on Substack as well as Rumble and a bunch of other platforms. Where do you mostly want people to follow you at this point, Glenn?
Yeah, the writing is on Substack. I do video reports on Rumble. And then there's a new podcast app called Colin, which a bunch of people like Brianna Joy Gray and Matt Taibbi and many others are using. So any of those platforms will do. And also, of course, my frequent appearances here on Breaking Point, most importanly of all.
Yeah, absolutely. You do the Rumble like video segments.
Yeah, I love those.
Are really good. I know you put a lot of time and effort into those. And that's not, I guess I maybe have added respect for it because it's similar to what we do. So I'm a little like personally like, oh, he's doing a good job at that thing. Anyway.
Thank you.
Wanted to bring you on to focus in particular on the dangers of how 1/6 has been weaponized to further the interests of the security state. Because in a lot of ways, 1/6 was like a dramatic failure in terms of being able to protect the Capitol and keep people out and keep the barricades up. So this massive failure for the security state that they then, as they always do, somehow turn around and use to make themselves only stronger. So was hoping you could lay out some of those implications.
Sure. So my reference point for the overall dynamic you're describing, in which some event takes place that produces a justifiable level of fear in the population, which is then seized upon by authorities and centers of power in order to exploit and augment that fear more and more as the days and months pass from that event in order to gain more power for themselves. Obviously, for me at least, is based in my experience doing reporting on and analysis of the first war on terror, which was very similar. There was obviously a traumatic event, which is the 9/11 attack that killed 3,000 Americans on the same day. But there was never any mass casualty attack anywhere close to it up until this very moment, 20 years later. And yet so many of the quote unquote temporary measures adopted in its name, such as the Patriot Act and a whole variety of other spying and detention powers, remain not just embedded as though it happened a month ago rather than 20 years ago, but they've been expanded wildly beyond their original intent. And for years, that was the strategy, was to constantly remind people of how visceral those fears were, because fear is a very strong motivating factor for humans. Knowing that the more ethereal or abstract concerns on the other side of the ledger, the erosion of civil liberties, the invasion of privacy, the breakdown of due process, are much more abstract and distant concerns that are often no match for reminding people of 3,000 dead Americans buried under a huge pile of rubble. So that is very much the similar dynamic. I think we see that with COVID, by the way, as well, where you talk about people dying in the hospital and nothing can compete with that in terms of the cost, whether it's children being out of school for 2 years and mental health crises from isolation and lockdown that just seem less visceral. The same is true here. Everybody saw the footage. Everybody agrees, who's decent, that those were horrible things to watch. We never want political violence in our politics. But the attempt to keep it in perspective has been almost impossible, given the concerted effort to exploit the emotions surrounding January 6th and to turn it into something that it never was, an attempted coup, an insurrection, as though 1,000 Trump supporters got anywhere close to overthrowing the most militarized, armed, and powerful government in the history of mankind. And obviously this week is an effort to rejuvenate that exploitation.
Well, that's what you always point to, Glenn, in terms of the actual record of this whenever it comes to the justice system. Lay that out for us. What 1 year later, as we assess it, relative to the crackdown on people's lives and the actual militarization of Washington, D.C., the shutdown of the presidential inauguration, they turned our city into a legit green zone for months. 1 year later, what do we know about the prosecutions and the way that the government has responded to this in an official manner?
So I'll just use a different frame of reference just to set the groundwork for that, which is the Russiagate investigation. For years, we were told that there was rampant criminality on the part of the Trump campaign and then the Trump administration for having criminally conspired with the Kremlin. There was a lot of debate about whether that happened. They got a prosecutor everyone trusted, Robert Mueller, to lead an 18-month probe with a huge team of prosecutors who were heralded as the most talented and aggressive, an unlimited amount of funds, subpoena power. And at the end of the process, a grand total of 0 Americans, 0, was charged with and convicted of the original crime that was alleged, which was criminally conspiring with the Kremlin to interfere in the 2016 election. Not one single American was even charged with that because, according to the Mueller investigation, they couldn't find evidence establishing that crime was committed, and yet it didn't remotely deter, even to this day, people from alleging that happened. Exactly the same thing, Saagar, is happening here. I don't know why media outlets feel entitled to refer to the January 6th riot as an insurrection, as though there's no debate about it, when we are now a full year into what the FBI itself heralds as the largest law enforcement operation in the history of the FBI. 700 people or more are now charged with the crime in association with January 6th. Not a single one, not one of those people has been charged with insurrection, inciting insurrection, attempting to overthrow the government, sedition, treason. They're all just common crimes of trespassing or violent assault for the ones who use violence, interrupting government procedures, processes. So if this were actually an insurrection or a seditious act or a coup, why is the Justice Department, under the control of the Biden administration, not William Barr or Donald Trump, not charging anybody with what those crimes are that are alleged to have taken place? They're charging them with very common crimes that happened in protests and riots instead, because that's what that event was.
You know, it's interesting because I see really now for the first time a significant number of liberals online who are upset about this, who are angry at Merrick Garland, who feel like, why do we just have these low-level crimes that are being charged and these, low-level actors who aren't at the high level? Where are the big charges? Where's the big revelation of the plot that we've kind of been led to believe should be forthcoming by the leaders that we ultimately trust? So I kind of understand why they feel angry right now that they haven't gotten what they ultimately were promised by this narrative.
I totally agree. And again, it's the same thing that happened in Russiagate. Remember, for 3 years, nobody was allowed to speak ill of Robert Mueller. We weren't allowed to remind people that he was the one who went before Congress as the FBI director and assured the Congress that they had definitive evidence that Saddam Hussein had nuclear and biological weapons. We weren't supposed to remind anybody that he was the one who oversaw the rounding up of Muslims after 9/11 without due process, because to do so was to impugn the integrity of the brave men and women in the FBI who keep us safe. There was a prohibition on treating him as anything other than a hero. And then suddenly, when he didn't deliver, when he closed his investigation without frog marching Donald Trump and Ivanka Trump and Donald Trump Jr. and Steve Bannon out of the White House and Jared Kushner, whoever their fantasies were, then suddenly everyone turned on him. And in fact, Adam Schiff in his book basically said that Robert Mueller was senile because they needed, it's like it's kind of like an apocalyptic cult. If you keep promising everyone that doomsday is coming on a specific date and then it doesn't happen, you have to provide an explanation about why it didn't to keep the flock believing. The same thing has happened here. They kept promising, that Merrick Garland was going to come in, not even 1/6, but that they were going to prosecute Trump and Trump officials based on the obstruction of justice that Mueller laid out, that for some reason this honorable prosecutor and all of his aggressive prosecutors themselves didn't prosecute, but Merrick Garland was going to do that. He hasn't done anything like that. And they also think that, like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and like Lauren Boebert and all the members of Congress that they hate are also going to be rounded up very shortly and put in prison. And they're starting to see that's not going to happen either. And you're right, this disillusionment, they're now turning on Merrick Garland the way that they did finally turn on Robert Mueller, is normal and natural. But at some point, you would think these liberals would start to question whether the people they're listening to, the media outlets and the political leaders, are actually trustworthy, the way they keep leading them down this path that leads to a dead end and not to this promised land of nirvana. And yet, so far, at least, it doesn't seem to be happening. They just keep blaming. I saw today, for example, Eli Mistel, the correspondent at The Nation, a beloved star of MSNBC, who was on Democracy Now!, ranting and raving against what he called the two white prosecutors, Merrick Garland and Robert Mueller, for failing to do their job by not putting Trump in prison. This is still where their rage is going.
And Glenn, the lack of prosecution leads to some other interesting questions around the fact that we know for a fact that many of the people who are on video as ringleaders or people who pushed actual riots on January 6th have either not been indicted or taken off the most wanted list and more. Could you elaborate on that? I mean, that seems to be another area of inquiry. It's like, well, yes, there is lack of prosecution, and that raises some interesting questions about what exactly was going on here.
Yeah, I mean, I spent 10 years devoting a lot of reporting time, as did several other journalists associated with the left. It was a very popular form of reporting on the way in which the FBI would infiltrate what they regarded as threatening groups of young, typically Muslim men in the United States, and would use infiltrators and informants to lure them into plots that they themselves had never thought of and hadn't indicated any interest in pursuing, but the informants manipulated them into agreeing to join the plots, and then the FBI would swoop in at the last minute and praise itself and congratulate itself for disrupting a plot that they themselves had concocted. So we know for certain that the FBI is doing the same thing to far-right groups, which they say is the number one threat to American national security, not Russia, not China, not Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but right-wing domestic extremists. Because in the Gretchen Whitmer case, the kidnapping case that was such a big deal was made of that before the election, we now know that at least half, if not more, of the people in that plot, including the leaders, were acting at the behest of the FBI. We also know for sure, Saagar, that the FBI had at least 2 informants on the ground embedded in the crowd, because the New York Times itself confirmed that. And, you know, you have a congressional committee presumably or purportedly attempting to get to the bottom of what happened, and they have zero interest in asking why the FBI didn't do that, right? You would expect them to be angry that the FBI didn't. We were talking before about 9/11 and the failure that that was by the NSA with their billions of dollars every year not to detect this plot, or the FBI. Why didn't the FBI have their tentacles in these groups? Or if they did, what is it that they knew? And are there people who were ringleaders who aren't being prosecuted for that reason? Is a question that the people who have the capacity to answer that, namely the Justice Department and the 1/6 Congressional Committee, are steadfastly refusing to get near, which only makes those suspicions more valid.
What do you make of the fact, Glenn, that, you know, the last time that cable news networks got good ratings was basically 1/6. And so they've devoted a lot of time and coverage to exploring that day, exploring their personal feelings on that day. There's this congressional inquiry. So Washington has really wanted to focus a lot of time and attention on 1/6. Even as the public isn't really following them there. I mean, the top concerns for people are things like inflation, the economy, healthcare. I mean, the same sorts of things that people generally are concerned about. So what do you read into the fact that the public has, by and large, not gone where the media has wanted to lead them?
So, I mean, the dirty little secret of the liberal wing of the corporate media is that nobody benefited more from Donald Trump and his presidency and his campaign and then the aftermath more than that sector, the liberal wing of the corporate media. It saved enormous amounts of jobs. It generated enormous ratings. January 6th was the single most watched day in CNN's history. So, of course, they have an interest in trying to rejuvenate and remind everyone and get everybody all excited again. But one of the things I was always trying to say during Russiagate was that I don't believe that Americans wake up in the morning thinking at all, let alone first and foremost, about what the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin are doing, even though that was like 70% of what cable news and liberal outlets were talking about. And I think the same is true for January 6th. Why would they? It was like 900 Trump supporters, you know, 2 of whom had never left their couch, so they dropped out of a heart attack, a 3rd of whom died of a speed overdose, and the 4th was shot in the neck by a member of the Capitol Hill Police. They killed nobody. There were no weapons brandished inside the Capitol. There have been no repeats since then. The problem, Krystal, is that there's these really warped incentives where if you're the New York Times or if you're CNN, you only need to rile up a certain percentage of the population that's very small, and it can be completely homogenized. They're all liberals. They're all like-minded. But all you need is like 2 or 3 million of them to just get very invested in these fears again in order for them to become profitable again. But the news itself is completely detached from the concerns of the overwhelming majority of Americans who obviously are concerned with a million other things, from school closures to the pandemic to inflation to their labor conditions, infinitely greater than the trauma of Hunter Walker and like other journalists who go onto Brian Stelter's show to do their therapy instead of doing it where they should, which is with a psychologist. So there's this enormous cleavage between what the media is trying to talk about and what the public is interested in, which is why nobody watches their program.
Yeah, I couldn't think of a better way in order to spend January 6th, Glenn. It's a solemn day. This is the real reason that the it matters to so many of the people in power, and that it's not even to whitewash, what was objectively a terrible event. But we got to talk about it in the way that it deserves. So thank you, man. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Glenn. Great to see you.
Great to be with you guys on this very difficult day. My solidarity to both of you.
Solidarity, man. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to know why we do this show, I actually do think today is a pretty good example. Being able to expose so much of the way that people in power weaponize objectively terrible things in order to try crack down on your life, be it COVID, be it January 6th, and ignore their own role in creating the situation where people hate each other, where our lives are miserable. So, I mean, I'm very, very proud of the show that we put together today. I think it's a perfect representation of us. We appreciate your support as always, but I'm just thinking about, I don't know what I would do without the show. Like, I think I would be sitting at home just losing my mind, trapped in some corporate media job or something, whispering to my friends, getting drunk on the weekend and just being like, God, I hate my job.
I'd be drinking a lot more.
Yeah,
There's no doubt about that.
True.
That's 100% the case. Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, I think January 6th deserved coverage, but I think it deserved coverage that was productive, that could lead us somewhere better. Rather than the easiest thing in the world to do is say, those people were idiots, they were assholes, they were criminals, they were bad, the Republican Party is bad, Trump is bad. Okay, what now? How do we end up in this place?
Yeah.
What's next? Those are not, those 900 people being assholes or whatever, that's not a solvable problem. There's always gonna be some percentage of the public that are assholes and idiots who do stupid things, especially if they're led in a certain direction. So it's not ultimately productive, and it just makes things worse when the sum totality of all your coverage day in and day out is why this half of the country is terrible and irredeemable. If you're a liberal outlet, it's the Republicans. If you're Fox News or the conservative outlets, it's the liberals and the left. That doesn't lead us ultimately anywhere productive and useful. So did our best to put together a show that was a little bit forward-looking, that tried to delve into some of those deeper issues. And we appreciate you guys supporting us in our ability to do this so that Saagar and I can stay away from being alcoholics.
Yeah, no, actually. So, thank you, guys. We really appreciate it. We got big plans. We will see you all next week.
Love you guys. See you next week. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it, you get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.